Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna of Russia, born Princess Elizabeth Alexandra Louise Alice of Hesse and by Rhine on 1 November, 1864. She was the second child of Ludwig IV, Grand Duke of Hesse and by Rhine, and Princess Alice, second daughter of Queen Victoria of United Kingdoms. By birth Elizabeth was a German Hessian and Rhenish princess of the House of Hesse-Darmstadt, and the wife of Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia, the fifth son of Emperor Alexander II of Russia and Princess Marie of Hesse and by Rhine. To her family, she was known simply as Ella. Princess Alice brought up her daughters simply. An English nanny presided over the nursery, and the children ate plain meals of rice puddings and baked apples and wore plain dresses. Her daughters were taught how to do housework, such as baking cakes, making their own beds, laying fires and sweeping and dusting their rooms. Princess Alice also emphasized the need to give to the poor and often took her daughters on visits to hospitals and charities. The family was devastated in 1873 when Ella's hemophiliac younger brother Friedrich, nicknamed Fritty, fell through an open window, struck his head on the balustrade, and died hours later of a brain hemorrhage. In the months following the toddler's death, Alice frequently took her children to his grave to pray and was melancholy on anniversaries associated with him. On the afternoon of the 7th of November, Victoria, although complaining of a sore throat, sat down to read to her brothers and sister. Later that evening she began to run a fever and was put to bed. The following morning, when her daughter was no better, the Grand Duchess called for the family physician, Dr. Eigenbrot, who, to Alice's great concern, discovered a white membrane on both sides of Victoria's throat, the first sign of diphtheria. This was the most traumatic and tragic sequence of events in the lives of the Grand Ducal family. Of all 6 children, only Ella remained unaffected. Ella was moved out of Victoria's room. On the 10th of November Alex fell ill. On the 13th of November, in an attempt to keep Ella free of the disease, Alice sent her with her governess, Miss Jackson, to stay with Princess Charles. Elizabeth's sister Marie died on the 16th of November, 1878, and her mother Alice died on the 14th of December. Elizabeth, who had been sent to her paternal grandmother's home at the outbreak's beginning. When she was finally allowed to return home, she described the meeting as terribly sad and said that everything was like a horrible dream. In her early youth Ella was charming and a very accommodating personality. Elizabeth was considered to be one of the most beautiful women in Europe at that time. Her older first cousin Prince Wilhelm of Prussia called her exceedingly beautiful. In fact, she is the most beautiful girl I ever saw. In April 1875, 16-year-old Wilhelm visited Darmstadt to celebrate Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine's 12th birthday and first expressed interest in 11-year-old Elizabeth. When he was a student at Bonn University, he often visited his Aunt Alice and his Hessian relatives on the weekends. During these frequent visits, he fell in love with Elizabeth, but she declined. Henry Wilson, later a distinguished soldier, also vied unsuccessfully for Elizabeth's hand. The future Frederick II, Grand Duke of Baden, Wilhelm's first cousin, proposed to Elizabeth. Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia, son of Emperor Alexander II of Russia and Empress Marie of Hesse and by Rhine, was also an admirer of Ella. They were first cousins once removed. Elizabeth's great-grandfather, her father's paternal grandfather, Louis II, Grand Duke of Hesse, was Sergei's maternal grandfather, and had known each other all their lives. There were hesitations on both sides, and Elizabeth first rejected his proposal of marriage. Queen Victoria, who had anti-Russian sentiments, opposed the marriage of her motherless granddaughter. Elizabeth and her surviving sisters were not pressured into following political marriages, they were allowed to follow their own inclination. After the couple spent some time together at Schloss Wolfsgarten in Darmstadt in September 1883, Elizabeth agreed to marry him. Their engagement was announced and celebrated publicly on the 26th of February, 1884 when Sergey returned to visit her in Darmstadt. When he arrived at the News Palais that February, he had with him a wealth of jewels that he showered on his bride-to-be. After they were married, among the engagement presents Sergey brought with him to Darmstadt were ropes of jewelry and brooches of ores. Sergey and Elizabeth married on the 15th of June, 1884, at the chapel of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. It was at the wedding that Sergey's 16-year-old nephew, Tsarevich Nicholas, first met his future wife, Elizabeth's youngest surviving sister, Alex. Later Alexandra Feodorovna. Elizabeth was not legally required to convert to Russian Orthodoxy from her native Lutheran religion, but she voluntarily chose to do so in 1891. Upon her conversion to Russian Orthodoxy, she took the name Elizaveta Feodorovna. Duchess Marie of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, Elizabeth's Lutheran sister-in-law who had not converted to Russian Orthodoxy, insisted that it was a disgrace for a German Protestant princess to go over to the Orthodox faith. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had once been in love with her, declared that she converted because of an inordinate pursuit of popularity, a desire to improve her position at court, a great lack of intelligence, and also a want of true religiousness. The new Grand Duchess made a good first impression on her husband's family and the Russian people. Everyone fell in love with her from the moment she came to Russia from her beloved Darmstadt. The couple settled in the Beloselsky-Belozersky Palace in St. Petersburg, after Sergey was appointed Governor-General of Moscow by his elder brother, Tsar Alexander III, in 1892. They resided in one of the Kremlin palaces. During the summer, they stayed at Ilyanskoye, an estate outside Moscow that Sergey had inherited from his mother. The viceregal role of Governor-General of Moscow was one that was answerable only to the emperor. Grand Duke Sergei was a political hardliner who shared his brother's inalienable belief in strong, nationalist government. Sergei's tenure began with the expulsion of Moscow's 20,000 Jews. It started 4 weeks before he arrived in person, after the publication of an imperial ukase by the Minister of the Interior Ivan Dernovo, by which all Jews of lower social stance, artisans, minor traders, and so on, had to be expelled from Moscow. On the 29th of March, the first day of Passover, the city's Jewish population learned of the new decree that called for their expulsion. In 3 carefully planned phases over the next 12 months, Moscow's Jews were expelled. The first to go were the unmarried, the childless, and those who had lived in the city for less than 3 years. Next, it was the turn of apprentices, of families with up to 4 children, and those with less than 6 years residency. Last of all, it was the turn of the old Jewish settlers with large families and/or numerous employees, some of whom had lived in Moscow for 40 years. Young Jewish women were made to register as prostitutes if they wanted to stay in the city. During the expulsion in January 1892, homes were surrounded by mounted carsacks in the middle of the night, with temperatures of -30 degrees Celsius -22 degrees Fahrenheit, while policemen ransacked every house. The Brest station was packed with Jews of all ages and sexes, all in rags and surrounded by meager remnants of household goods, all leaving voluntarily rather than face deportation. Sergey, as Governor-General, was petitioned by the police commissioners to stop the expulsions until the weather conditions improved. While he agreed, the order was not published until the expulsions were over. Some of the expelled Jews moved to southern and western regions of the empire, although there were many who decided to emigrate abroad. As a result of the expulsion, Moscow lost 100 million rubles in trade and production, 25,000 Russians employed by Jewish firms lost their livelihoods, while the manufacture of silk, one of the city's most lucrative industries, was all but wiped out. In 1891, Ella and Sergei's arrival in Moscow was marred by tragedy that September, not long after Paul and Alexandra arrived at Ilyanskoye to spend the late summer with them. One afternoon, the 21-year-old Grand Duchess Alexandra, who was 7 months pregnant with her second child, followed the path down from the back of the house to the waiting small boat and she suddenly collapsed. Her frantic husband, brother and sister-in-law were helpless to help, and doctors were too far away. The midwife was called Alexandra and gave birth to a tiny premature baby boy. Alexandra died 6 days later. Alexandra's sudden death was crushing and an unbelievable blow to Paul, Sergey, and Ella. Worse news was soon to follow when, during the first week of March 1892, Grand Duke Louis suffered a paralytic stroke that brought his family hurrying to his bedside. Ernie, Alex, Victoria, and Irene, he raised his whole face off the pillow, put out his hand, and stroked Ella's face. On the evening of the 13th of March, he lapsed into a coma and died. The couple never had children of their own, but their Ilyanskoye estate was usually filled with parties that Elizabeth organized especially for children. It was rumored that their childlessness was due to Grand Duke Sergei's homosexual tendencies. They eventually became the foster parents of Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich and Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, Sergei's niece and nephew. Maria wrote in her memoirs about her Aunt Ella, "She and my uncle seemed never very intimate. They met for the most part only at meals and by day avoided being alone together. They slept, however, up to the last year of their life together, in the same great bed. Maria and Dmitri resented their aunt and uncle, blaming them for the forced separation from their real father, who had abandoned them. Elizabeth was instrumental in the marriage of her nephew by marriage, Tsar Nicholas II, to her youngest sister Alex. Much to the dismay of Queen Victoria, Elizabeth had been encouraging Nicholas, then Tsarevich, in his pursuit of Alex. When Nicholas did propose to Alex in 1894, and Alex rejected him on the basis of her refusal to convert to Orthodoxy, it was Elizabeth who spoke with Alex and encouraged her to convert. When Nicholas proposed to her again, a few days later, Alex then accepted. On the 15th of February, 1905, the family attended a concert at the Bolshoi Theatre in aid of Elizabeth Feodorovna's Red Cross War Charities, a terrorist organization that knew the route. The Socialist Revolutionary Party's combat detachment had planned to assassinate Sergei that day. However, one of their members, Ivan Kaliev, noticed the children in the carriage and decided to call off their attack. To kill the Grand Duchess and the children would surely have sparked a wave of apprehension throughout the empire and would have set back the revolutionary cause by years. After lunching with his wife at Nicholas Palace on the 17th of February, Sergey left unaccompanied for the Governor-General's mansion. Because of the looming threat, Sergey had refused to take his adjutant, Alexei, since he was married and a father. The arrival of the Grand Duke's recognizable carriage, drawn by a pair of horses and driven by his coachman Andrei Rudinkin, alerted the terrorist who had been waiting in the Kremlin with a bomb wrapped in newspapers. Just before 1445, the carriage of the Grand Duke passed through the gate of Nikolskaya Tower of the Kremlin and turned the corner of the Chudov Monastery into Senatskaya Square. From a distance no more than 4 feet (1.2 meters) away and still some 60 feet (18 meters) inside the Nikolsky Gate, Ivan Kaliev stepped forward and threw a nitroglycerine bomb directly into Sergei's lap. The explosion disintegrated the carriage, and the Grand Duke died immediately. Scattered all over the blood-stained snow lay pieces of scorched cloth, fur, and leather. The body of the Grand Duke was mutilated, with the head, the upper part of the chest, and the left shoulder and arm blown off and completely destroyed. Some of the Grand Duke's fingers, still adorned with the rings he habitually wore, were found on the roof of a nearby building. On impact, the carriage horses had bolted towards the Nikolsky Gate, dragging with them the front wheels and coachbox as well as the semi-conscious and badly burned driver, Rudinkin, whose back had been riddled with bits of bomb and stones. He was rushed to the nearest hospital, where he died 3 days later. Kaliev, who by his own testimony had expected to die in the explosion, survived. Sucked into the vortex of the explosion, he ended up by the remains of the rear wheels. His face was peppered by splinters, pouring with blood. Kaliev was immediately arrested, sentenced to death, and hanged 2 months later. The Grand Duchess rushed to the scene of the explosion. Stunned but perfectly controlled, she gave instructions, and, kneeling in the snow, helped to gather up Sergei's remains. The remains were placed on a stretcher and covered with an army greatcoat. Deeply affected by the Grand Duke's death, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna retired from the royal family and founded the Russian Orthodox convent of Martha and Mary, where she dedicated herself to the care of Moscow's poor and suffering. Part of the obligations of the Sisters of the Martha and Mary Convent was to make an annual pilgrimage to the sepulchral church in memory of the Grand Duke on the day of his repose. The 4th of February, Elizabeth wore mourning clothes and became a vegetarian. In 1909, she sold off her magnificent collection of jewels and other luxurious possessions. Even her wedding ring was not spared. With the proceeds, she opened the convent of Saints Martha and Mary and became its abbess. She soon opened a hospital, chapel, pharmacy, and orphanage on its grounds. Elizabeth and her fellow nuns worked tirelessly among the poor and the sick of Moscow. She often visited Moscow's worst slums and did all she could to help alleviate the suffering of the poor. For many years, her institution helped the poor and the orphans in Moscow by fostering the prayer and charity of devout women. On October 17, 1910, Grand Duchess Elizabeth took leave of her sisters and boarded her train en route for Germany. She arrived at Wolfsgarten for a cheerful reunion with the rest of surviving family. Her ill health was aggravated by the high anxiety her sister, Alexandra, felt for her son. From the first signs of hemophilia 6 weeks after his birth from Moscow, Elizabeth had observed this mounting dependence with dismay. She knew all about Rasputin's true nature, and she had none of her sister's naive credulity. Soon after his acceptance by the imperial couple, rumors began to spread in St. Petersburg society that Rasputin had been a member of the Klisti. Elizabeth warned Alexandra several times that the holy man was a fraud and a lecherous drunkard, but Alexandra would flatly refuse to believe her. In 1915, the All-Russian Zemstvo Union was organized under Elizabeth's auspices to provide support for sick and injured soldiers during the First World War. In April 1916, Ella visited the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna at the Anichkov Palace, where the talk was of nothing but the need to dispose of the peasant Rasputin. Frustration was reaching boiling point, and in the face of Alex's obstinacy, Ella knew that it could not be long before someone would be driven to act. However, Elizabeth was worried about her relatives, who were under house arrest in the Alexander Palace in Tsarskoye Selo. She kept in touch with her sister Alexandra, even when she was in exile in Tobolsk, although under considerably more difficult conditions. In 1918, Vladimir Lenin ordered the Cheka to arrest Elizabeth. They then exiled her first to Perm, then to Yekaterinburg, where she spent a few days and was joined by the Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich, Princes John Konstantinovich, Konstantin Konstantinovich, Igor Konstantinovich and Vladimir Pavlovich Paley. Grand Duke Sergei's secretary, Fyodor Ramez, and Varvara Yakovleva, a sister from the Grand Duchess's convent. They were all taken to Alapeyevsk on the 20th of May, 1918. At noon on the 17th of July, Cheka officer Pyotr Startsev and a few Bolshevik workers came to the school. They took from the prisoners whatever money they had left and announced that they would be transferred that night to the upper Syniachikensky factory compound. The Red Army guards were told to leave and Cheka men replaced them. That night the prisoners were awakened and driven in carts on a road leading to the village of Syniachika, some 18 kilometers, 11 miles, from Alapeyevsk, where there was an abandoned iron mine with a pit 20 meters, 66 feet, deep. Here they halted. The Cheka beat all the prisoners before throwing their victims into this pit, Elizabeth being the first. Ryabov tossed in a grenade after them and grenades were then hurled down the shaft. Following the explosion, he claimed to have heard Elizabeth and the others singing an Orthodox hymn from the bottom of the shaft. Unnerved, Ryabov threw down a second grenade, but the singing continued. Finally a large quantity of brushwood was shoved into the opening and set alight, upon which Ryabov posted a guard over the site and departed. Elizabeth's last words were, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Elizabeth's body was found vertical, her arms folded over her body. Both hands tightly clenched, fingers bent, her nails sunk into the skin. Head, eyes, and nose were tied with a handkerchief folded in 4 layers.